Sarah looked like any normal passenger in seat 14F. Nobody knew she was Colonel Falcon Chin, America's most famous fighter pilot. When terrorists threatened her flight and F-22 jets appeared for escort, shocked passengers discovered the quiet woman reading a romance novel was actually a legendary war hero. Before watching full story, comment below from where are you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Chun looked like any other passenger in Denver International Airport. She wore simple blue jeans and a black sweater. Her hair was tied back in a normal ponytail. She carried one small bag and walked slowly through the busy terminal. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody knew her secret. She was Colonel Sarah Falcon Chin, one of the best fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. Her call sign Falcon was famous among military pilots around the world. She had flown dangerous missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. She had saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers. She had shot down enemy planes and rescued pilots from behind enemy lines. But today she just wanted to be a normal person flying home to see her family. Sarah found her gate and sat down quietly. She pulled out a romance novel and started reading. Around her, other passengers talked about normal things, the weather, their jobs, where they were going. A businessman next to her was complaining about his delayed flight. A young mother was trying to keep her two children calm. An elderly couple was discussing their vacation plans. "Excuse me," said the businessman, whose name tag read, Mike Thompson. "Are you flying to Washington too?" "Yes," Sarah said with a smile. "Just visiting family." "I hate flying," Mike said. "Always makes me nervous. Especially with all the crazy things happening in the world these days." "Flying is actually very safe," Sarah said gently. She knew more about aviation safety than almost anyone in the world, but she could not tell him that. A young woman sitting across from them joined the conversation. "I'm Emma Rodriguez. I work for a computer company in DC. This is my first time flying alone and I'm really scared." "Don't worry," Sarah said. "The pilots are very well trained. They know what they're doing." If only they knew, Sarah thought to herself. She had trained some of the best pilots in the Air Force. She had flown in storms, combat zones, and emergency situations that would terrify most people. But she kept these thoughts to herself. The gate agent announced that Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. was ready for boarding. Sarah gathered her things and got in line with the other passengers. She had seat 14F, a window seat in the middle of the plane. Perfect for staying invisible. As they boarded the Boeing 737, Sarah noticed the pilots greeting passengers at the door. Captain James Morrison looked experienced, probably former military. His co-pilot, Lisa Park, seemed young but confident. Sarah nodded politely as she passed them, just like any other passenger. She found her seat and put her bag in the overhead bin. Mike Thompson sat down next to her in 14E. Across the aisle, Emma Rodriguez was still looking nervous. "First time?" asked an elderly man named Robert Chin, no relation to Sarah, who sat in front of Emma. "No, I've flown before," Emma said. "But I always get scared during takeoff." "I was a mechanic for airlines for 30 years, Robert said. "These planes are built to handle anything. You'll be fine." Sarah smiled quietly. She had flown planes that were much less safe than this comfortable passenger jet. She had taken off from aircraft carriers in storms, landed on damaged runways under enemy fire, and flown planes with broken engines back to base. But these civilians had no reason to know about any of that. The flight attendants went through their safety presentation. Sarah had heard it thousands of times, but she always paid attention. Safety was important, whether you were flying a civilian airliner or an F-22 fighter jet. As they taxied to the runway, Mike Thompson gripped his armrest tightly. "I really hate this part," he said. "Just breathe slowly," Sarah advised. "Focus on something else. What do you do for work?" "I sell insurance," Mike said. "Boring stuff. What about you?" "Government work," Sarah said. It was true, just not the whole truth. "Pretty boring too." The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky. Mike closed his eyes tightly. Emma across the aisle was doing the same thing. Sarah looked out the window at the mountains of Colorado disappearing below them. She had flown over these mountains many times in military jets, but the view was always beautiful. Once they reached cruising altitude, the passengers relaxed. The flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks. Mike opened his eyes and seemed relieved. Emma started reading a magazine. Robert was doing a crossword puzzle. "See," Sarah said to Mike. "That wasn't so bad." "You're right," Mike said. "Thanks for helping me stay calm. You seem like you're used to flying." "I travel a lot for work," Sarah said, which was completely true. For the first hour of the flight, everything was perfectly normal. Sarah read her book. Mike worked on his laptop. Emma listened to music. Robert finished his crossword puzzle and started a Sudoku. The flight attendants served everyone drinks and pretzels. Then things started to change. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received instructions from air traffic control to change our flight path slightly due to some weather in the Washington area. We might be a few minutes late arriving, but we'll do our best to make up the time." Most passengers accepted this explanation without question. Weather delays were normal. But Sarah noticed something that the others missed. The plane had changed direction, but not toward the usual alternate route for weather. They were flying further north than necessary. Her trained military instincts told her something else was happening. She was right. High above them, two F-22 Raptor fighter jets were approaching at supersonic speed. Major David Hawk Williams and Captain Jennifer Lightning Zhang were among the best pilots in the Air Force. They had been scrambled from Andrews Air Force Base with an urgent mission. "Lightning, this is Hawk," Major Williams said through his radio. "Confirm we have the right commercial flight?" "Affirmative, Hawk," Captain Zhang replied. "United Flight 447, Denver to Washington. VIP package on board." "Roger that. Any word on the nature of the threat?" "Intelligence says there's a credible terrorist threat against a high-value target on that civilian aircraft. We're providing escort and protection until they land safely." "Copy. Moving into escort position." The two F-22s took up flanking positions around the commercial airliner. They were invisible to the passengers inside, flying at a distance that provided protection without being seen. Inside Flight 447, Sarah was becoming more alert. The change in the plane's flight path, combined with her years of experience, told her that something unusual was happening. She kept her expression calm and continued reading her book, but her mind was analyzing the situation. Captain Morrison received another radio message, this one through encrypted military channels. "Flight 447, this is Washington Control. Be advised you have Colonel Sarah Chin aboard, call sign Falcon. She is the target of the security threat we briefed you about." Morrison's co-pilot, Lisa Park, looked surprised. "Falcon? The Falcon from the Middle East operations?" "Keep your voice down," Morrison said quietly. "But yes, that's who we're talking about." Every military pilot knew the legend of Falcon. She was the pilot who had single-handedly saved an entire Marine unit surrounded by enemy forces in Syria. She had flown through heavy anti-aircraft fire to provide air support, then landed her damaged F-22 in a desert clearing to evacuate wounded soldiers. She had been shot down over Iraq and evaded capture for 3 days before being rescued. She had trained dozens of pilots who went on to become heroes themselves. "Where is she sitting?" Park asked. Morrison checked his passenger manifest. "Seat 14F. The woman in the black sweater who was reading when we greeted passengers." Park remembered her. A quiet, polite woman who had seemed completely ordinary. "She doesn't look like a fighter pilot." "That's probably intentional," Morrison said. "Someone like Falcon would want to travel without attracting attention." Meanwhile, the terrorist threat that had triggered this protection mission was very real. Intelligence agencies had intercepted communications about a planned attack against the female pilot who destroyed our operations in Syria. They knew Falcon was traveling on a civilian flight, and they wanted revenge for her successful combat missions that had disrupted their activities. But the terrorists had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the response of the United States military when one of their most valued pilots was threatened. Within minutes of the threat being identified, F-22s had been launched, special forces teams had been deployed, and a comprehensive protection plan had been put into action. Back on Flight 447, passengers were starting to notice that their flight path seemed unusual. Emma Rodriguez looked out her window and saw they were flying over mountains instead of the flat farmland she expected. "Are we still going to Washington?" she asked Robert. "I think so," Robert said, though he looked a bit confused too. "Maybe the weather is worse than they told us." Mike Thompson was getting nervous again. "This doesn't feel right. We've been flying for 2 hours and we should be getting close to landing." Sarah continued to appear calm, but internally she was preparing for whatever might happen. Her military training had taught her to always be ready for unexpected situations. She mentally reviewed the layout of the aircraft, the location of emergency exits, and potential defensive positions if needed. The critical moment came when Captain Morrison received orders to establish communication with his VIP passenger. This was highly unusual, but the circumstances were extraordinary. "Flight 447, this is Washington Control. We need you to identify Colonel Chin to your crew and establish communication with the escort aircraft. She needs to be briefed on the tactical situation. Morrison took a deep breath. He had never been in a situation like this. Understood, Washington Control. He switched to the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. I need to speak with Colonel Sarah Chin. Colonel Chin, if you're on board, please press your call button immediately. The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers looked around at each other in confusion. Colonel Sarah Chin? Who was that? There was no one on the plane who looked like a military colonel. Sarah closed her book and calmly pressed the call button above her seat. A flight attendant hurried over, looking puzzled. Are you Colonel Chin? The flight attendant asked quietly. Yes, I am, Sarah said simply. Mike Thompson's mouth fell open. You're a colonel? In the military? Yes, Sarah said. Emma Rodriguez stared at her from across the aisle. But you said you did boring government work. It's not always boring, Sarah said with a slight smile. Word spread quickly through the cabin. The quiet woman in 14F, who had been reading a romance novel and giving advice about flying, was actually a military officer. But none of them understood yet just how significant this was. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom again. Colonel Chin, we have military aircraft providing escort for our flight. They need to speak with you directly. A flight attendant brought Sarah a handheld radio. She keyed the microphone professionally. This is Colonel Chin. Major Williams' voice came through the radio, broadcast throughout the cabin so everyone could hear. Colonel Chin, this is Major Williams, call sign Hawk, flying F-22 escort. Ma'am, it is an honor to be providing protection for you today. The passengers were amazed. F-22 fighter jets? Escorting their commercial flight? And they were talking to the woman who had been sitting quietly in seat 14F? Captain Zhang's voice joined the conversation. Falcon, this is Captain Zhang, call sign Lightning. Ma'am, every pilot in the Air Force knows your service record. We are honored to fly escort for a true American hero. Sarah keyed the radio again. Thank you, Hawk and Lightning. What's our tactical situation? Ma'am, we had credible intelligence about a terrorist threat targeting your flight. The threat has been neutralized by ground forces, but we're maintaining escort until you land safely. Now the passengers began to understand. This wasn't just any military officer. This was someone important enough to warrant F-22 fighter jet protection. Someone the pilots called Falcon, and referred to as a hero. Robert, the former airline mechanic, spoke up. Falcon? Are you the pilot they call Falcon? Sarah nodded reluctantly. Oh my God, Robert said. You're the one who saved those Marines in Syria. My nephew was one of them. He told me about the pilot who flew through enemy fire to get them out. Other passengers started pulling out their phones, searching for information about Falcon pilot Syria. The stories they found were incredible. A female F-22 pilot who had flown the most dangerous combat missions of the past decade. A pilot who had saved hundreds of lives through her courage and skill. A pilot whose tactics were studied at military academies around the world. Mike Thompson read from his phone. Says here you were shot down over enemy territory and evaded capture for 3 days before being rescued. It was only 2 days, Sarah corrected modestly. Emma found an article about Falcon's most famous mission. You landed your damaged fighter jet in a combat zone to evacuate wounded soldiers? By yourself. I had backup coming, Sarah said, though everyone could tell she was being humble. The flight attendants were amazed. They had been serving peanuts and soft drinks to one of the most decorated military pilots in American history, and they had no idea. As Flight 447 continued toward Washington, the F-22 pilots requested permission to perform a special honor. Washington Control, this is Hawk. Request permission to render military honors to Falcon as we complete escort duties. Permission granted, Hawk. All aircraft in the area are cleared to observe. Captain Morrison announced to the passengers, Ladies and gentlemen, the F-22 pilots escorting our aircraft have requested to perform a military flyby in honor of Colonel Chen. This is an extremely rare tribute reserved for the most distinguished military heroes. The 2 F-22 Raptors moved into formation where passengers could see them through the windows. The sleek, powerful fighter jets that had been protecting them were now visible, flying in perfect formation beside the commercial airliner. Sarah felt tears in her eyes. Throughout her career she had focused on the mission, never seeking recognition or glory. But this moment, surrounded by civilian passengers and honored by fellow pilots, touched her deeply. The F-22s performed a precise ceremonial formation flight, a tribute that demonstrated both their exceptional flying skills and their deep respect for Falcon. The maneuver was flawless, a testament to the professionalism of the pilots and the honor they felt in protecting a living legend. Passengers pressed against the windows to watch the tribute. Many of them took photos and videos, though they were witnessing something that rarely happened, a military honor performed for a hero while she traveled as a civilian. "I can't believe this is happening," Emma said. "We're flying with a real war hero." "Not just any war hero," Robert said. "One of the best pilots who ever lived." As they approached Washington, D.C., the passengers began to understand the full magnitude of what they had experienced. They had shared a flight with one of America's most decorated military heroes. They had been protected by the country's most advanced fighter aircraft. They had witnessed military honors that few civilians ever see. The elderly man, Robert, approached Sarah as they prepared to land. "Colonel, I served in Vietnam. I know what it means to put your life on the line for others. Thank you for your service and thank you for showing us what real heroism looks like." Other passengers nodded in agreement. Mike Thompson, who had been nervous about flying, now felt proud to have shared the flight with someone so brave. Emma Rodriguez, who had been scared of her first solo flight, realized she had been safer than she ever could have imagined. As Flight 447 touched down at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, the F-22 escort completed their mission. Major Williams and Captain Zhang had successfully protected one of their most respected colleagues and had the honor of serving alongside a living legend. In the terminal, Sarah was met by security personnel and military liaisons who had been coordinating her protection. The terrorist threat had been real, but the military response had been overwhelming and effective. "Colonel Chin," said the security chief, "we apologize for the disruption to your travel. Your safety is our highest priority." Sarah understood that her days of anonymous travel were probably over. Once her identity as Falcon was compromised, she would need to take additional security precautions for future trips. But as she said goodbye to her fellow passengers from Flight 447, she realized something important had happened. These civilians had seen the military community at its best, professional, respectful, and dedicated to protecting others. They had witnessed the bonds of honor and respect that exist between military aviators. Mike Thompson shook her hand before they parted ways. "Colonel, thank you for your service and thank you for showing us what real courage looks like. You could have told us who you were from the beginning, but you didn't need the attention or recognition. That says everything about your character." Emma Rodriguez hugged her goodbye. "You made me feel safe even before I knew who you were. That's just who you are." Robert, the Vietnam veteran, saluted her respectfully. "It was an honor to fly with you, Colonel. Falcon is a call sign that will be remembered for generations." As Sarah walked through the terminal toward her connecting flight to visit her family, she reflected on the day's events. She had wanted a quiet, anonymous flight, but instead had been reminded of the respect and gratitude that her service had earned. The call sign Falcon wasn't just a name, it represented years of dangerous missions, countless lives saved, and a level of skill and courage that inspired everyone who heard her story. The F-22 pilots who had escorted her would return to their base and share the experience of protecting Falcon herself. Her legend would continue to grow, inspiring future pilots to strive for excellence in service of their country. And somewhere in military bases around the world, young pilots would hear the story of how Falcon flew as a civilian passenger, humble and quiet, until duty called and her true identity was revealed. They would learn that real heroes don't seek attention or glory, they simply do what needs to be done with skill, courage, and honor. Colonel Sarah Falcon Chin had reminded everyone on Flight 447 that heroes walk among us every day, usually without fanfare, carrying their service with dignity and pride. Her story would be told for years to come, inspiring others to serve with the same dedication and humility that made Falcon a legend in military aviation. The quiet passenger in seat 14F had shown them all what it truly means to be a hero.